The silence in the Thorn estate was more terrifying than any scream, a heavy, suffocating quiet that smelled of expensive lilies and slow-motion death. While the world whispered that the Mafia Heir, Cashin, was rotting from a cursed bloodline, Samantha looked past the dying boy to find the cold, silver truth buried against his skull. Samantha was a master of being invisible, a nursing student hiding behind a waitress's apron in a diner that felt like a funeral waiting to happen. Everything changed when the Shadow King, Don Valerius Thorn, watched her calm a chaotic meltdown with a quiet patience his own violent world couldn't understand. He didn't want a nanny. He wanted a miracle worker for a son everyone else had given up on. But as Samantha's fingers brushed through Cashin's dark hair during his first bath in the Thorn Fortress, she didn't find a disease. She found raw, weeping wounds and the glint of something that wasn't supposed to be there, a deliberate, hidden torture that proved the boy wasn't dying of natural causes. He was being murdered in plain sight. Before we continue our story, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe button, and really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The iron gates of the Thorn estate didn't just open. They groaned like the jaws of a leviathan swallowing a meal. As the black SUV crunched up the winding gravel driveway, Samantha clutched her worn duffel bag until her knuckles turned the color of the overcast sky. Through the tinted glass, the mansion loomed, a brutalist masterpiece of gray stone and jagged glass that seemed to watch her approach with cold, predatory indifference. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress built on secrets and blood. And as a nursing student who had spent her life trying to blend into the peeling wallpaper of Hell's Kitchen, Samantha felt like a moth flying directly into a spotlight. The front doors were opened by a man who looked more like a wall than a human being, but he wasn't the one who commanded the room. Standing in the center of a vaulted foyer was Lucinda Thorn. She was a woman carved from ice and dressed in midnight silk. Her hair was a sharp, platinum bob that looked capable of drawing blood, and her eyes, a piercing, unnatural blue, scanned Samantha with the clinical disgust one might reserve for a smudge of dirt on an expensive rug. The air around her was thick with a cloying, heavy scent of expensive lilies and something metallic, a perfume that seemed designed to mask the smell of decay. "So," Lucinda said, her voice a low, cultured purr that set Samantha's teeth on edge. "This is the miracle worker Valerius dragged out of a grease trap. My brother has always had a flair for the dramatic, but hiring a waitress to handle a medical crisis is a new low, even for him." Samantha felt the familiar sting of being looked through, but she didn't lower her gaze. She had dealt with enough drunk dock workers and entitled businessmen at the diner to know that bullies fed on silence. "I'm a nursing student, Ms. Thorn, and I'm here because your brother asked me to help his son." Lucinda laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Help him? Darling, you're here to witness a slow-motion funeral. Cashin is a lost cause. He is violent, deranged, and quite frankly, a danger to everyone in this house. He takes after his mother, a woman who spent her final days screaming at shadows in a padded cell. It's in the blood, you see. You can't nurse away a rotten lineage." She stepped closer, the scent of lilies becoming suffocating. Lucinda leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt like a threat. "My advice to you, Samantha, keep the door locked. Feed him through the slot like the animal he's become, and collect your absurdly high check. Don't try to be a hero." The last 3 nurses left in tears, one of them with a permanent scar across her cheek. This house eats people who think they can play savior. Before Samantha could respond, Lucinda turned on her heel, the silk of her dress swishing like a serpent's tail against the marble. She didn't look back as she gestured for a guard to lead Samantha away. The walk to the West Wing felt like a descent into another world. The opulent gold leaf and bright chandeliers of the main house faded, replaced by dim corridors and a heavy, unnatural silence. There were no family photos here, no signs of life. Just cold stone and the faint, rhythmic hum of the high-end security cameras tracking their every move. The guard, a silent man with a face like granite, finally stopped at a heavy oak door at the very end of the hall. It was reinforced with steel, and a heavy slide bolt was engaged on the outside. "He's in there," the guard grunted, his first words of the trip. He slid the bolt back with a heavy thwack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet hall. "Don't say we didn't warn you." He pushed the door open just enough for Samantha to slip through, and then slammed it shut behind her. The sound of the bolt sliding back into place felt final, a mechanical goodbye to the world outside. The room was vast, but felt like a prison. The curtains were heavy velvet, drawn so tight that only slivers of gray afternoon light pierced the gloom. The air was stale, smelling of unwashed skin and a strange, chemical sharpness that Samantha couldn't immediately identify. In the far corner, tucked away in the shadows of an oversized canopy bed, she saw a small, huddled shape. "Cashin," she whispered, her voice cracking the stillness. A low, guttural growl came from beneath the mountain of blankets. It wasn't the sound of a child. It was the sound of a creature that had forgotten it was human. Samantha didn't move closer. She knew from her clinical rotations that a cornered patient was a dangerous one. Instead, she sat down on the floor, several feet from the bed, and leaned her back against the wall. She didn't reach for him. She didn't demand his attention. She simply reached in her bag, pulled out a textbook, and began to read aloud in a low, steady rhythmic tone. Hours passed. The room grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, but Samantha didn't turn on the lights. She just kept reading, her voice a tether to reality in the suffocating darkness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mountain of blankets began to shift. A pair of wide, dark eyes peered out from the shadows, eyes that didn't look mad, but looked hunted. Samantha caught her breath. The boy was pale, his skin almost translucent in the dim light, and his hair was a matted, tangled disaster of dark curls. But it wasn't his appearance that froze her heart. It was the way he held himself. He sat with a strange, unnatural stiffness, his head tilted at an awkward angle, as if the mere weight of his own skull was causing him agony. As he watched her, his small hands gripped the edge of the blanket, his knuckles white. He looked like he was waiting for a blow to fall, for a needle to strike, for the help everyone promised to turn into more pain. In that moment, Samantha knew Lucinda was wrong. This wasn't a monster. This was a victim. And the fortress she had just entered wasn't protecting the boy. It was keeping the world from seeing what was being done to him. The first few days in the Thorn estate felt like navigating a minefield draped in velvet. Samantha quickly learned that the care Cashin had been receiving was nothing more than a structured form of abandonment. Meals were left on heavy silver trays outside the door, cold and untouched, and the only other person who entered the room was a silent, grim-faced nurse who spent exactly 5 minutes inside before rushing out with a look of frantic relief. Samantha, however, refused to leave. She slept on the floor by the window, her presence a steady, non-threatening shadow in the corner of the boy's world. She didn't force him to talk, and she didn't try to touch him. Instead, she brought the diner with her. She told him stories about the eccentric regulars at Sal's, the way the city smelled after a summer rain, and the dream she had of becoming a pediatric nurse. For 72 hours, the only response she got was the occasional rustle of blankets or the sound of his ragged breathing. On the fourth morning, the silence broke. Samantha had been humming a low tune while sketching in a notebook when a small, gravelly voice cut through the air. "Why do you stay?" Samantha froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't turn around too quickly. "Because you're the most interesting person I've met in this big, lonely house, Cashin." A pale hand emerged from the blankets, trembling. "It hurts," he whispered. "The bad thoughts. They make my head heavy." Samantha moved slowly, crawling on her knees until she was a few feet from the bed. Up close, the chemical smell she had noticed earlier was stronger, a sharp, medicinal tang that reminded her of industrial-grade antiseptic mixed with something sweet and sickly. "What does it hurt, Cashin? Can you show me?" The boy didn't point to his chest or his stomach. He reached up and gingerly touched the back of his head, his face contorting in a grimace of pure agony. "The spiders. They bite when I'm bad." "Spiders?" Samantha's nursing instincts flared. "May I look? I promise I won't hurt you. If you want me to stop, just say the word, and I'll move away." It took a long minute of agonizing silence before Cashin slowly turned his back to her. He lowered the collar of his silk pajamas, revealing a neck that was painfully thin. As Samantha reached out, her hand steady despite the roar of adrenaline in her veins, she felt a wave of cold fury wash over her. The boy's hair was a matted, tangled mess, but as she gently parted the dark curls near the base of his skull, she saw it. The skin wasn't just bruised, it was a map of horror. There were small, circular punctures, some weeping with a yellow discharge, others crusted over with black scabs. But it wasn't a skin condition. As her fingers brushed a particularly swollen area, she felt a hard, metallic resistance. She gasped, pulling her hand back. Beneath the matted hair, someone had been inserting something into the boy's scalp. It wasn't spiders. It was physical, mechanical torture. "Does it hurt more when the spiders are there?" she asked, her voice trembling with forced calm. "Aunt Lucinda says they come because I'm a thorn," Cashin whispered, his voice small and hollow. "She says the thorn blood is poison, and the spiders try to let it out." The realization hit Samantha like a physical blow. Lucinda wasn't just neglecting the boy. She was gaslighting him, convincing a 7-year-old that his own body was his enemy, while she systematically broke him. The dying Heir wasn't sick. He was being processed for a grave. Suddenly, the heavy oak door swung open with a violent bang. Samantha jumped to her feet, instinctively shielding Cashin with her body. Lucinda stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hall. She looked radiant in a deep crimson dress, but her eyes were fixed on Samantha with a predatory sharpness. "Checking the patient's progress, are we?" Lucinda asked, her voice sliding through the room like a blade. She didn't look at her nephew. She looked at Samantha's hands, which were still hovering near Cashin's head. "He's in a lot of pain, Ms. Thorne," Samantha said, her voice turning into a shield. "He needs a real doctor, not a nurse, not a waitress. A specialist." Now, Lucinda stepped into the room, the scent of lilies suddenly overwhelming. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, stopping just inches from Samantha. "I told you, Samantha. He's a lost cause. His mind is unraveling. Whatever pain he's describing is a figment of a diseased imagination. It's a symptom of his decline. It's not in his head," Samantha countered, her invisibility finally shattering into a defiant rage. "It's on his head. I saw the marks." Lucinda's expression didn't change, but her pupils dilated, making her blue eyes look like two black voids. She reached out and gripped Samantha's chin, her nails digging into the skin. "You were hired to be a companion, not a detective. If you continue to poke around in things you don't understand, you'll find that the Thorne estate has a very long memory for people who overstep." She let go, shoving Samantha back slightly. Lucinda turned to the huddled shape on the bed, her voice softening into a terrifying, mocking sweetness. "Sleep now, Cashin. Don't let the new girl fill your head with lies. You know what happens when you get too excited. The spiders get hungry, don't they?" Cashin whimpered, pulling the blankets over his head until he disappeared completely. Lucinda turned back to Samantha, her face a mask of cold perfection once more. "The Don is busy with business in the city for the next 2 days. You will stay in this room. You will not speak to the staff, and you will certainly not attempt to treat what you cannot comprehend. Am I clear?" Samantha didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was already racing, calculating. She looked at the medical bag she had smuggled in, the one containing her nursing supplies, local anesthetics, and sterile tweezers. She looked at the door, where Jax, the massive head of security, was now standing like a silent sentinel. She was a prisoner in a house of killers, but as she looked at the trembling boy beneath the blankets, Samantha knew she couldn't wait for the dawn to return. If she didn't get those objects out of Cashin's scalp tonight, he wouldn't live to see another morning. The dying Heir was running out of time, and Samantha was the only one who dared to check the one detail that would either save his life or end hers. The moon was a pale, judgmental sliver hanging over the Thorne estate when Samantha finally moved. The house had settled into a heavy, artificial slumber, the kind of silence that felt like a predator holding its breath. In the corner of the room, Cashin's breathing had leveled out into a fitful, shallow rhythm. Samantha reached for her duffel bag, her fingers finding the hidden compartment where she had stashed her nursing kit. In the dim glow of a single night light, the steel of the tweezers and the glass vials of local anesthetic caught the light like dangerous jewelry. She knew the risks. If Lucinda caught her, Samantha wouldn't just be fired, she would be erased. But as she looked at Cashin, she saw the way his small body twitched in pain, even in sleep, his hands clawing at the silk sheets. She couldn't wait for the dawn's return. She crept to the bedside, her movements as fluid and silent as a ghost. "Cashin," she breathed, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. The boy bolted upright, his eyes wide and glassy with terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but Samantha was faster, pressing a finger to her lips while showing him a small, carved wooden bird she had brought from the diner. "It's me, Cashin. It's Samantha. I'm going to make the spiders go away. But you have to be the bravest boy in the world. You have to be silent." He stared at her, the moonlight catching the tears, tracking through the dust on his cheeks. Slowly, with a shuddering breath, he nodded. Samantha worked with a precision born of desperation. She applied a topical numbing cream to the inflamed areas of his scalp, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she feared the security cameras would pick up the sound. She had no surgical suite, no overhead lights, just a pen light held between her teeth and the steadying fire of her own defiant rage. As the medicine took hold, she began the extraction. The first object was a 2-inch silver needle, rusted at the tip, which had been driven deep into the soft tissue behind his ear. Samantha's stomach turned. This wasn't an accident. It was a map of calculated agony. She pulled it free with a sickeningly soft schlick sound, followed by a fragment of jagged green glass that had been hidden beneath a cluster of matted curls. Cashin's small body shook, his fingers digging into Samantha's forearm, but he didn't make a sound. He watched her with a look of profound, heartbreaking wonder, as if he couldn't believe someone was actually taking the pain away instead of giving it. "One more," Samantha whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The final object was the worst. It was a thin copper wire, coiled like a spring and embedded near the base of his skull. As she worked it loose, Samantha realized the chemical smell was coming from the wire itself. It had been coated in a slow-release toxin, something designed to cause fever, hallucinations, and lethargy. This was why everyone thought he was losing his mind. He wasn't rotting. He was being chemically dismantled. Just as the wire came free, a shadow flickered under the door. Samantha froze, the bloody tweezers still in her hand. She extinguished the pen light, plunging the room into darkness. The heavy slide bolt on the outside of the door rattled. "I know you're awake in there, girl," a voice rumbled. It was Jax, the head of security. Samantha shoved her kid under the bed and pulled Cashin into her lap, wrapping the blankets around them both. She forced her breathing to slow, even as the door creaked open. The beam of a high-powered flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the dust motes in the air like tiny sparks. The light landed on them, the invisible waitress holding the broken air. Jack stood in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the hall light. He didn't speak for a long time. The light lingered on Cashin's face, which, for the first time in months, looked peaceful. Then, the beam drifted to the floor, where a single, blood-stained cotton ball had fallen. Samantha held her breath, ready to fight, ready to die. But then, something impossible happened. Jax didn't radio for help. He didn't call Lucinda. He simply lowered the flashlight. "The cameras in this wing go on a 3-minute loop at the top of the hour," Jack said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "You have exactly 180 seconds to hide that trash and clean the boy up. If she finds so much as a drop of blood, neither of us makes it to sunrise." Before Samantha could gasp, he stepped back in the hall and pulled the door shut, the bolt sliding home with a definitive, protective click. Samantha sat in the dark, stunned. The monster's guard had just given her a window. She wasn't just fighting Lucinda anymore. She had found an ally in the lion's den, and the war for Cashin's life had officially begun. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, no longer feeling like a spotlight, but like a reprieve. For the first time since Samantha had arrived at the Thorne estate, Cashin wasn't huddled in a ball of misery. He sat upright in bed, his small face still pale, but devoid of the localized agony that had pinched his features for months. The fever that had plagued him, the one Lucinda claimed was a sign of his rotting brain, had broken. Samantha moved with a new sense of urgency. She knew that the physical extraction of the needles and wire was only half the battle. Now, she had to prove the intent. She spent the morning meticulously cleaning the wounds with a saline solution she had mixed in secret, watching as Cashin tracked her every move with a quiet, intense devotion. He was no longer a feral animal. He was a child who had found his first anchor. "Samantha," he whispered, his voice clearer than it had been the night before. "Yes, Cashin. Will she come back with more spiders?" Samantha stopped her work, looking him directly in the eyes. "No, I won't let her. But I need you to help me. I need you to be a little actor. When Aunt Lucinda comes in, you have to pretend it still hurts. You have to stay under the blankets. If she sees you're better, she'll know I touched you." The boy nodded solemnly, a soldier accepting his orders. The confrontation came sooner than expected. The door groaned open, and Lucinda stepped in, trailing that suffocating scent of lilies. She was dressed in a sharp, ivory suit that looked like armor. Behind her stood two guards Samantha hadn't seen before, men with vacant eyes and the heavy gait of professional cleaners. "The dawn has been delayed in the city," Lucinda announced, her eyes sweeping the room with a cold, analytical hunger. She walked toward the bed, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble. "He's distraught, of course. He's finally ready to sign the commitment papers. The Swiss facility is expecting Cashin by the end of the week." Samantha stood her ground, her heart racing. "He isn't going anywhere. He's improving." Lucinda stopped, a slow, cruel smile spreading across her face. "Improving? Samantha, look at him." She reached out a gloved hand to pull back the blanket, and Cashin, remembering his role, let out a low, practiced whimper. "He is a hollow shell. My brother needs to move on. He needs to focus on the family business, not the tragic leftovers of a failed marriage." She turned back to Samantha, her voice dropping to a hiss. "I noticed you've been busy, Samantha. One of the maids found a blood-stained cotton ball in the laundry chute. It seems you didn't listen to my warning about playing doctor." Samantha felt a cold sweat prickle her neck. Jax had warned her, but she hadn't accounted for the laundry. Lucinda stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "You think you're so clever, coming from your little diner to save a prince. But this isn't a fairy tale. In this house, we don't cure problems. We remove them." Lucinda signaled to the two guards. "Take her to the basement. I want to know exactly what she thinks she found, and then I want her gone. And by gone, I mean the way all Thorne's problems disappear." As the guards moved in, Samantha realized the slow-motion funeral had just turned into an execution. She looked at Cashin, who was shaking beneath the sheets, and then at the door, hoping for a sign of Jax. But the hallway was empty. As the heavy hands of the guards clamped onto her arms, Samantha didn't scream. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the tiny digital recorder she had hidden there, a device she had started running the moment Lucinda entered the room. She might be going to the basement, but she wasn't going without the truth. The air in the basement of the Thorne estate didn't smell of lilies. It smelled of damp earth and old iron. Samantha was shoved into a chair in the center of a room that looked like a cold storage vault, her wrists stinging where the guards had gripped her. Above her, a single exposed bulb flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the stone walls. Lucinda entered a few minutes later, having removed her ivory jacket. She looked like a surgeon preparing for a difficult procedure. She paced a slow circle around Samantha, her heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete. "You have a certain spark, Samantha. I'll give you that. Most people in your position would be begging for their lives by now. But you're sitting there wondering if you turned the recorder in your pocket on correctly." Samantha's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face a mask of stone. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lucinda reached out, her fingers nimble as she plucked the small device from Samantha's pocket. She held it up to the light, smiling. A digital recorder? How quaint. Did you think this was a courtroom drama? In this house, I am the judge, the jury, and for people like you, the executioner. She dropped the device onto the floor and crushed it beneath the heel of her shoe with a sickening crunch. What? Samantha asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. He's a child. Your own flesh and blood. Why would you go to such lengths to destroy him? Lucinda stopped pacing and leaned in close, her eyes devoid of anything resembling humanity. Because Cashin is the only thing standing between me and the total control of the Thorn Empire. My brother is a sentimental fool. He sees his dead wife in that boy's eyes, and it makes him weak. If Cashin is broken, Valerius will step down to care for him, leaving the business to the only person capable of running it. Me. By killing him? Samantha spat. Not killing, Lucinda corrected smoothly. Institutionalizing. The Swiss facility I've chosen is very specialized. They will keep him in a state of chemical twilight for the rest of his life. He won't feel a thing. And you were supposed to be the final witness to his insanity. Instead, you decided to be a doctor. Lucinda turned to the guards. Take her to the pier. I want her and the boy processed tonight. Make it look like a tragic kidnapping gone wrong. Tell the Don that the nurse tried to flee with his son and the car went into the harbor. The boy too, one of the guards asked, his voice wavering slightly. Especially the boy, Lucinda snapped. He's seen too much. He's already started to look at her like she's some kind of saint. I can't have him waking up. The guards hauled Samantha up, but as they dragged her toward the heavy steel door, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Jack stepped into the light, his arms crossed over his massive chest. The SUV is ready, Miss Thorne. I'll handle the transport personally. No need for these two to get their hands dirty on a family matter. Lucinda looked at Jax, her eyes narrowing. For a long, agonizing second, the room was silent. Then, she nodded. Fine, use the black Suburban. And Jax, make sure there's no trace left. I don't want to spend my victory party answering questions from the Port Authority. Jax grabbed Samantha by the arm, his grip like a vice. He didn't look at her as he hauled her out of the basement and toward the garage. He threw her into the back of the SUV, where a small, shivering bundle was already waiting. Cashin was curled in the corner of the seat, his eyes wide with a terror that broke Samantha's heart. As the garage door opened and the SUV roared into the night, Samantha looked at the back of Jax's head. She reached out to pull Cashin into her arms, whispering words of comfort. She didn't believe herself. They were heading to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a place where people went to disappear forever. She looked at Jax's reflection in the rearview mirror, but his eyes were shielded by dark glasses. She had thought he was an ally, but as the lights of the city faded into the dark industrial skyline of the pier, Samantha realized she might have been wrong. In the world of the Thorns, loyalty was a currency, and she had nothing left to pay with. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and skeletal cranes that clawed at the midnight sky. Jax killed the headlights, letting the SUV roll to a stop at the edge of a crumbling pier where the black water of the East River slapped rhythmically against the pylons. Samantha held Cashin so tightly she could feel the frantic, bird-like thrumming of his heart against her ribs. Jax stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on broken glass. He walked to the rear, yanked the door open, and reached for Cashin. No! Samantha shrieked, throwing herself over the boy. You'll have to kill me first. Jax didn't roar. He didn't pull a weapon. He leaned into the car, his massive frame blocking out the moon, and whispered, I'm counting on you to stay that brave for the next 10 minutes, Samantha. Now, get out. Both of you. He hauled them out, but instead of dragging them toward the water's edge, he pushed them behind a stack of rusted steel drums. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a heavy, waterproof case. Inside sat a tablet and a high-gain microphone. I've spent 2 years watching that woman peel the soul off this boy, Jack said, his voice a low, vibrating growl of suppressed fury. I'm security, Samantha. I see everything. I saw the needles. I saw the toxins. But in the Thorne family, a guard's word against a blood relative is a death sentence. I needed a witness. I needed someone Lucinda would be arrogant enough to confess to. Samantha stared at him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The basement. You were recording her? Every word, Jack said, tapping the tablet. And I have the footage from the nursery. I couldn't move until I knew Cashin was safe. If I had tried to stop her alone, she would have had us both buried before the dawn even got back to the city. But you changed the math, Samantha. You gave the boy his voice back. He handed her a burner phone and a heavy 9mm pistol. Samantha recoiled from the weapon. I don't know how to use that, she stammered. Pray you don't have to, Jack said, checking his watch. Lucinda is on her way here. She wants to see the bodies. She doesn't trust anyone to do the job right. I'm going to stage the execution using 2 weighted bags I've already prepped in the trunk. When she sees them go into the water, she's going to gloat. That's when the recording starts. Suddenly, the roar of a high-performance engine echoed through the shipyard. Headlights cut through the dark, sweeping over the steel drums. A silver Mercedes slewed to a halt 20 yards away. Hi, Jack's hissed. And whatever you hear, do not move until I give the signal. Samantha pulled Cashin into the shadows of a shipping container, her hand over his mouth. Through a gap in the steel, she watched as Lucinda stepped out of the Mercedes. She had changed into a trench coat, looking like a dark angel of death. She walked to the edge of the pier, her heels clicking with terrifying confidence. Is it done, Jax? Lucinda's voice carried over the wind, cold and impatient. Ready to go, Ms. Thorne, Jax replied, dragging 2 heavy, human-sized duffel bags toward the edge. Wait, Lucinda said, stepping closer to the bags. A cruel, triumphant smile curled her lips. I want to say goodbye. It's a shame, really. Cashin had his father's eyes. But those eyes would have looked at me with too much judgment once he realized I was the one holding the crown. She kicked one of the bags, her laughter a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the night. Tell me, Jax, did the nurse scream? Did she beg for that little diner life of hers? She was defiant to the end, Jax said, his hand hovering near his jacket. Good, Lucinda purred. I hate a coward. It makes the kill feel so hollow. Now sink them. I have a brother to comfort and a kingdom to claim. As Jax tipped the first bag over the edge, the splash echoed like a thunderclap. Samantha gripped the pistol in her shaking hands, her eyes fixed on Lucinda's back. The trap was set, but as Lucinda turned back toward her car, she paused, her eyes landing on a familiar smudge on the ground. A small, wooden bird that had fallen from Cashin's pocket during the struggle. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the splash. Lucinda picked up the toy, her face twisting into a mask of pure, murderous realization. She didn't look at Jax. She looked directly at the shipping container where Samantha was hiding. Jax, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. Why is there a toy on my pier? The air on the pier turned to ice as Lucinda stood frozen, the small wooden bird clutched in her gloved hand. Her eyes, usually as cold as a winter sea, now burned with a frantic, lethal intelligence. She looked from the toy to the black water where the bags had disappeared, and finally, she turned her gaze toward Jax. The massive guard didn't flinch, but the silence between them was a physical weight, thick with the scent of salt and impending blood. A bird, Jax, Lucinda whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the vibration of a predator realizing it had been toyed with. Cashin never went anywhere without this. If he were in that bag, he would have been clutching it until his knuckles turned white. She dropped the toy, and it hit the concrete with a hollow, mocking click. Where are they? Jax didn't answer. He simply reached into his jacket, and for a second, Samantha thought he was pulling his weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small, glowing tablet. I've been recording for 10 minutes, Lucinda. The Don is on the line. He's been listening to every word you said about peeling the soul off his son. Lucinda's face contorted into something unrecognizable, a mask of pure, jagged malice. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. With a speed that defied her elegant stature, she reached into the small clutch at her waist and pulled out a snub-nosed revolver. Then he can listen to the sound of your failure. Crack. The gunshot echoed through the shipping containers like a whip. Samantha screamed, pulling Cashin deeper into the shadows of the rusted steel. She saw Jax stumble back, his shoulder blooming with crimson, but he didn't fall. He fired back, the heavy roar of his 9mm drowning out the wind, but Lucinda had already dived behind the engine block of her Mercedes. "Run!" Jax roared, his voice strained as he slumped against a crate, using his good arm to keep his weapon trained on the car. "Samantha, take the boy and get to the service tunnel. Don't look back." Samantha didn't hesitate. She grabbed Cashin by the waist and bolted. Her boots hammered against the wet pavement, the world blurring into a kaleidoscope of gray metal and black water. Behind her, the sounds of the shootout continued. Sharp, rhythmic pops of lead against steel. She could hear Lucinda screaming orders into her own radio, summoning the cleaners who had been waiting at the perimeter. They reached the edge of a massive, derelict warehouse, the entrance to the service tunnels. Samantha pushed Cashin inside, the air smelling of oil and ancient dust. They scrambled down a metal ladder, her hands slick with sweat and the grit of the shipyard. Below them lay a labyrinth of pipes and shadows, a subterranean vein that led back toward the city streets. "Stay quiet," Samantha breathed, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it would shatter her ribs. She checked the 9mm Jax had given her. It felt heavy and alien in her hand, a cold piece of iron that represented the line between life and death. In the distance, above them, she heard the heavy thud of boots on the warehouse floor. Lucinda hadn't stayed at the pier. She was hunting them. The Viper had been cornered, and a cornered thorn was more dangerous than 1,000 soldiers. Samantha looked at Cashin. The boy was shivering, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, but he wasn't crying. He looked at the gun in her hand and then at her face. "Are we going to be ghosts now, Samantha?" he whispered. "No, Cashin," she said, her defiant rage returning, hotter than ever. She tucked the gun into her waistband and grabbed his hand. "We're going to be the truth. And the truth doesn't stay buried." They moved deeper into the dark, the sounds of the hunt echoing through the pipes. Samantha knew the tunnels would eventually lead to the subway grates near the Navy Yard gate, but they were being followed by men who knew every inch of the Thorn territory. Every drip of water, every scuttle of a rat, sounded like a footstep. Just as they reached a junction, a beam of light sliced through the darkness from the tunnel ahead. Samantha pulled Cashin into a side alcove, her hand hovering over her weapon. The light grew closer, and a voice drifted through the gloom. Not Lucinda's, but a cold, mechanical voice over a radio. "Package located in Sector 4. Proceeding with disposal." They weren't just being hunted, they were being hemmed in. Samantha realized they couldn't run anymore. She looked at the heavy steam valve above her head and the narrow catwalk. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't a mobster. She was a nurse, and she knew exactly how to find a pulse and how to stop one. The service tunnel was a humid, claustrophobic vein of brick and iron, vibrating with the distant rumble of the city above. Samantha pressed her back against the weeping wall, her nursing instincts calculating the physics of the space. She knew that in a fair fight, she was a ghost, but this wasn't a fair fight. It was a surgery. The beam of the assassin's flashlight swept closer, illuminating the swirling steam from a leaky overhead pipe. Samantha reached up, her fingers finding the heavy iron wheel of a high-pressure bypass valve. As the shadow of the first cleaner elongated across the floor, she didn't aim the gun Jax had given her. Instead, she waited until the man was directly beneath the main junction and threw her entire weight into the wheel. With a deafening, metallic shriek, the valve gave way. A wall of scalding, blinding steam erupted into the tunnel. The assassin screamed as the white cloud swallowed him, his flashlight clattering to the ground. Samantha didn't wait to see him fall. She grabbed Cashin and the fallen flashlight, racing toward the end of the corridor where a vertical ladder led to the surface. They emerged into the freezing night air behind a row of tenements, miles from the pier, but still within the thorn shadow. Samantha didn't head for the police. She knew the local precinct was likely on the Thorn payroll. She headed for the one place Lucinda would never expect them to return, the Thorn estate. We're going back, Cashin whispered, his teeth chattering as they huddled in the back of a stolen laundry van Samantha had hot-wired with a desperation she didn't know she possessed. The Don is there, Cashin, Samantha said, her eyes fixed on the road. Jax told me your father was returning tonight. Lucinda thinks you're at the bottom of the river. We have to get to him before she can explain away your disappearance. The drive was a blur of neon lights and adrenaline. When they reached the iron gates of the estate, the guards were in a state of chaos. News of the kidnapping at the pier had clearly reached them, but in the confusion of the shifting shifts, no one expected the invisible nurse to come crashing through the side entrance. Samantha didn't stop the van until it slammed into the fountain in the front circular drive. She grabbed Cashin and ran toward the main entrance. The heavy doors were wide open. Inside, the foyer was filled with the low, frantic murmurs of soldiers and the sharp, piercing sound of Lucinda's grief. He's gone, Valerius. Lucinda's voice drifted from the grand study, dripping with a sickening, practiced sorrow. The nurse, she was a plant. She took him to the pier. By the time my men arrived, the car was already in the water. I'm so sorry. Samantha pushed past two stunned guards, her clothes torn, her face smeared with oil and shipyard grit. She burst into the study just as Don Valerius Thorne was reaching for a pen to sign the documents that would have handed his empire and his son's life to the woman who had tried to destroy them. He's not in the water. Samantha's voice cracked through the room like a gunshot. The study fell into a deathly silence. Valerius dropped the pen, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray as he looked at the doorway. Behind him, Lucinda recoiled as if she had seen a specter. Her ivory suit was stained with Jax's blood, and her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered madness. Samantha? Valerius breathed, his gaze shifting downward to the small, shivering boy clinging to her hand. Cashin. Aunt Lucinda made the spiders, Cashin said, his voice small but steady, echoing in the high-ceilinged room. He reached up and touched the back of his head, where the bandages Samantha had applied were visible. She put the needles in my head. Samantha took them out. Lucinda recovered her poise with a terrifying speed. Valerius, don't listen to her. The boy is hallucinating. The trauma has broken his mind completely. This woman is a kidnapper. Guards take them. But the guards didn't move. From the back of the room, a blood-soaked Jax stepped out of the shadows, holding his tablet aloft. The recording is already playing on the house speakers, Lucinda. Every word you said at the pier. Every kick you gave those bags. The Don has heard all. The audio of Lucinda's laughter and her confession about the chemical twilight began to boom through the mansion's integrated sound system. Valerius stood up, his massive frame trembling with a rage so profound the air seemed to hum. He looked at his sister, the viper he had invited into his nest, and then at Samantha, who had stood where no one else dared to look. The Shadow King didn't call for his soldiers. He walked toward his son, falling to his knees and pulling the boy into an embrace that had been 2 years in the making. The signature on the papers was forgotten. The only thing that mattered was the truth that the invisible waitress had pulled from the dark. The grand study was no longer a place of business, but a theater of reckoning. As the audio of Lucinda's cold, calculated confession reached its end, the silence that followed was heavier than a shipyard fog. Don Valerius Thorne stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the marble floor like a dark tide. He didn't look at the guards, and he didn't look at the millions of dollars in contracts on his desk. He looked only at his sister. Lucinda's composure finally shattered. The Ice Queen was gone, replaced by a woman trembling with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She lunged for the fallen pen, perhaps thinking she could still force a signature, but Jax, bloodied and swaying, kicked the desk away. Valerius, please, Lucinda gasped, her voice high and thin. I did it for the family. You were becoming soft. The boy was a liability. Valerius didn't shout. His voice was a low, terrifying whisper that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the windows. You didn't do it for the family, Lucinda. You did it for a throne built on the bones of my son. He gestured to the guards, his eyes never leaving hers. Take her. Not to the police. To the basement. She's so fond of the chemical twilight. Let her see how it feels to live in the dark. As the guards dragged a screaming Lucinda from the room, the oppressive weight that had hung over the Thorn estate for 2 years finally lifted. The scent of lilies was replaced by the crisp, cold air blowing in from the open foyer. Valerius turned back to Samantha. He looked at the girl from the diner, the invisible waitress who had seen what he was too blinded by grief to notice. He saw the bruises on her arms, the soot on her brow, and the way she still stood protectively in front of Cassian. "You saved him," Valerius said, his voice thick with an emotion that the Shadow King of Hell's Kitchen rarely showed. "You walked into a house of killers with nothing but a nursing kit and enough courage to shame my entire organization." "I didn't do it for you, Mr. Thorn," Samantha said, her voice steady as she finally let go of the pistol, placing on the desk. "I did it because he deserved a chance to grow up." Cassian looked up at his father, then back at Samantha. For the first time, his eyes weren't filled with the reflection of spiders or shadows. "Are you leaving now?" he asked, his small hand gripping the hem of her torn apron. Valerius stepped forward, placing a hand on Samantha's shoulder. It wasn't the heavy grip of a boss, but the touch of a man seeking redemption. "The diner is a memory, Samantha. This family owes you a debt that cannot be paid in weekly checks. Cassian needs more than a nurse. He needs the only person he trusts. And I need someone in this house who isn't afraid to tell me the truth." 6 months later, the Thorn estate was no longer a fortress of silence. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced by sheer linen that let the sunlight dance across the floors. The sound of child's laughter, real, vibrant laughter, echoed through the gardens where Cassian played, his dark curls healthy and free of the hidden horrors of the past. Samantha stood on the terrace, no longer invisible. She wore no apron, and she carried no duffel bag. As Valerius joined her, looking out over the empire he was now rebuilding with a newfound sense of justice, he handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a pin, not of gold or diamonds, but a small silver sparrow, the same shape as the wooden toy she had used to save his son. "To the girl who saw everything," Valerius whispered. Samantha smiled, watching Cassian run across the grass. She had come to the house as a maid, a ghost in the background of a tragedy. But in the end, she had proven that the most powerful weapon in any world, mafia or otherwise, wasn't a bullet or a blade. It was the courage to look where no one else dared, and the heart to never let go. The Thorn heir wasn't dying anymore. He was finally learning how to live. Wow, what an absolute heart-stopper. I was literally holding my breath when Samantha was trapped in those steam tunnels. What did you think of Jax's long game? Did you suspect he was secretly documenting Lucinda the whole time? Or did you think he was just another one of her monsters? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and survival touched your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more thrilling stories where the underdog takes down the mafia, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a beat. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.